So picture this. A man calls his mother from a hospital bed at 4 in the morning. Not a regular hospital visit, not a checkup, not something minor. He asks her to come. She comes. An hour and 12 minutes later, he is dead. He's 34 years old, and the sport that he had set on fire, the sport where he had won more races and more poles than anyone else just 3 years earlier, the sport where his red and gold Chevrolet had been one of the most recognizable machines on the planet, that sport responded with silence. No public memorial, no tribute lap, no moment of recognition at the next event. The local newspaper in his hometown tried to find out where he was buried and called every funeral home in Ashland, Ohio, and every single one denied handling the arrangements. NASCAR included one line about him in its official history. One line, and 0 photographs. A souvenir vendor at Pocono Raceway, a track where this man had won 4 times, told a reporter it was the first time he had ever heard the name. 3 years before that phone call, Tim Richmond had been the most electrifying driver in American motorsport. 7 wins in a single season, more victories and more poles than any other competitor in NASCAR in 1986. Co-driver of the year alongside Dale Earnhardt. He walked into victory lanes in silk suits, grinning like the night was just getting started, and the crowds loved him for it. And then, he vanished. The official story was double pneumonia. Then there was a drug test, then a lawsuit, then more silence, and then a death certificate with 3 entries that told the world everything NASCAR had spent 2 years trying to bury. This is the story of the most talented and most erased driver in NASCAR history, a wealthy Ohio outsider who lit the sport on fire and then watched it quietly let him burn. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the drivers history forgot on purpose. If you're someone who cares about the real stories behind motorsport, the ones that got buried because they were too inconvenient for the people in charge, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. To understand Tim Richmond, you cannot start at a racetrack. You have to start in Ashland, Ohio, where his father, Al Richmond, had invented a machine that could bore pipes under highways without digging them up. That single patent turned into a manufacturing company that exported worldwide and made the Richmond family wealthy in a way that was genuinely unusual in NASCAR circles. This was not a family scraping together sponsorship money and sleeping in the back of a hauler. Tim Richmond grew up with a private pilot's license at 16. One birthday, his parents gave him a Trans Am, a speedboat, and an airplane, all at once. His parents sent him to Miami Military Academy in Florida, partly because the family's wealth was creating complications at his local school. And he did not just survive there, he thrived. He set a conference record in the high hurdles, quarterbacked the state championship football team, and got his jersey retired. What he did not do was plan to become a race car driver. Here's the thing about Tim Richmond's entry into racing. It was an accident. In 1976, a friend of his father co-owned a sprint car, and Tim tagged along as a crew member. One day he took it out for some laps at Lakeville Speedway in Ohio. Somebody had a stopwatch. His times were faster than the regular driver. Just like that. No formal training, no years of go-karts, no racing lineage. His father bought him a car. He spun in his first competition and broke an axle. His father fired him as the driver. But the next season, Al bought him a super modified, better suited to his raw ability, and Tim won both Rookie of the Year and the track championship at Sandusky Speedway in 1977. After that, the trajectory just accelerated. USAC Sprint Cars in 1978, Sprint Car Rookie of the Year, Formula Super Vs at Phoenix, and then a phone call from Roger Penske's organization about an IndyCar ride. So picture this. A man calls his mother from a hospital bed at 4 in the morning. Not a regular hospital visit, not a checkup, not something minor. He asks her to come. She comes. An hour and 12 minutes later, he is dead. He's 34 years old, and the sport that he had set on fire, the sport where he had won more races and more poles than anyone else just 3 years earlier, the sport where his red and gold Chevrolet had been one of the most recognizable machines on the planet, that sport responded with silence. No public memorial, no tribute lap, no moment of recognition at the next event. The local newspaper in his hometown tried to find out where he was buried and called every funeral home in Ashland, Ohio, and every single one denied handling the arrangements. NASCAR included one line about him in its official history. One line, and 0 photographs. A souvenir vendor at Pocono Raceway, a track where this man had won 4 times, told a reporter it was the first time he had ever heard the name. 3 years before that phone call, Tim Richmond had been the most electrifying driver in American motorsport. 7 wins in a single season, more victories and more poles than any other competitor in NASCAR in 1986. Co-driver of the year alongside Dale Earnhardt. He walked into victory lanes in silk suits, grinning like the night was just getting started, and the crowds loved him for it. And then, he vanished. The official story was double pneumonia. Then there was a drug test, then a lawsuit, then more silence, and then a death certificate with 3 entries that told the world everything NASCAR had spent 2 years trying to bury. This is the story of the most talented and most erased driver in NASCAR history, a wealthy Ohio outsider who lit the sport on fire and then watched it quietly let him burn. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the drivers history forgot on purpose. If you're someone who cares about the real stories behind motorsport, the ones that got buried because they were too inconvenient for the people in charge, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. To understand Tim Richmond, you cannot start at a racetrack. You have to start in Ashland, Ohio, where his father, Al Richmond, had invented a machine that could bore pipes under highways without digging them up. That single patent turned into a manufacturing company that exported worldwide and made the Richmond family wealthy in a way that was genuinely unusual in NASCAR circles. This was not a family scraping together sponsorship money and sleeping in the back of a hauler. Tim Richmond grew up with a private pilot's license at 16. One birthday, his parents gave him a Trans Am, a speedboat, and an airplane, all at once. His parents sent him to Miami Military Academy in Florida, partly because the family's wealth was creating complications at his local school. And he did not just survive there, he thrived. He set a conference record in the high hurdles, quarterbacked the state championship football team, and got his jersey retired. What he did not do was plan to become a race car driver. Here's the thing about Tim Richmond's entry into racing. It was an accident. In 1976, a friend of his father co-owned a sprint car, and Tim tagged along as a crew member. One day he took it out for some laps at Lakeville Speedway in Ohio. Somebody had a stopwatch. His times were faster than the regular driver. Just like that. No formal training, no years of go-karts, no racing lineage. His father bought him a car. He spun in his first competition and broke an axle. His father fired him as the driver. But the next season, Al bought him a super modified, better suited to his raw ability, and Tim won both Rookie of the Year and the track championship at Sandusky Speedway in 1977. After that, the trajectory just accelerated. USAC Sprint Cars in 1978, Sprint Car Rookie of the Year, Formula Super Vs at Phoenix, and then a phone call from Roger Penske's organization about an IndyCar ride. The 1980 Indianapolis 500 was the moment that put Tim Richmond on the national radar. He ran the fastest unofficial practice speed of the month, faster than the race favorite Johnny Rutherford. He qualified 19th but was 5th fastest overall. Through the race, he ran up front, led a lap, and finished 9th. Solid for a rookie. But what people actually remembered happened after the checkered flag. Richmond's car ran out of fuel on the front stretch and stalled, sitting dead on the brickyard while the field rolled past. And then Johnny Rutherford, the race winner, pulled his car alongside the stranded Richmond and motioned him to hop on. Richmond climbed up on the side pod of the winning Penske car and rode into the victory lane with the champion. The photograph from that moment, 2 men on 1 car under the checkered flag at Indianapolis, hangs in the museum at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway today. They call it the Rookie and the Champ. That image tells you everything about who Tim Richmond was. He crashed, ran out of fuel, and still ended up in the photograph. The move to NASCAR came through a conversation with Pocono Raceway president Joseph Mattioli, who convinced Richmond to try stock cars after a string of crashes in open-wheel racing started to raise real questions about how long he would last in Indy cars. Richmond put it simply. He said in an Indy car you drove it, but in a stock car you raced it. He made his NASCAR debut in 1980 at Pocono and in 1981 ran 29 starts across 3 different teams, showing flashes of pace without a serious program to harness it. Then came 1982, a partnership with J.D. Stacy and legendary crew chief Dale Earnhardt. On June 13th of that year, at Riverside International Raceway in California, Tim Richmond won his first NASCAR Cup race. He was 26 years old. He swept both road course events at Riverside that season, and Benny Parsons, watching him navigate those S's, said it was unbelievable. 2 wins, 8 poles, 7 top 5s in 26 starts. Not a full season, but an absolute statement. He moved to Raymond Beadle's Blue Max team for 1983 through 85, driving the number 27 Old Milwaukee Pontiac, and kept his averages steady. A win a year, roughly 10th in points, and the following in the grandstands that kept growing while NASCAR's establishment mostly viewed him as a talented eccentric who did not quite fit the mold. Now, you might be thinking, plenty of drivers have been outsiders. What made Richmond so different that the sport couldn't figure out what to do with him? Look, it wasn't just that he was from Ohio or that he had money. It was everything about the way he carried himself. He showed up to Daytona one year after Hendrick had suggested he clean up his appearance, wearing a silk suit and carrying a cane and grinning at everyone like he was walking into a nightclub. He appeared in the 1983 Burt Reynolds film Stroker Ace. He got his hair cut in New York. He pulled his racing suit off his shoulders to sign autographs for female fans. He called friends at 2 in the morning for no reason. He got the nickname Hollywood, and he seemed to enjoy it more than it bothered him. The garage did not know what to make of him. Dale Earnhardt's world was Wrangler denim and Carolina drawl and earning everything through grit and physical force. Richard Petty was Southern royalty in a cowboy hat. The sport had been born on backcountry roads in moonshining territory, and its culture still reflected that DNA in every way imaginable. And here was this wealthy Ohio kid who flew in on private planes and talked about going to parties with Huey Lewis. Kyle Petty, who was younger and sharper about the sport's future than most of his peers, looked at Tim Richmond and saw something nobody else was seeing yet. He said Tim was the guy who would carry NASCAR forward because he was the one who was going to capture the 18 to 30 market. Kyle was right about the potential. He was just wrong about what would happen first. In 1986, Hendrick, who was building what would become the most dominant team organization in NASCAR history, paired Richmond with crew chief Harry Hyde in the number 25 Folgers Chevrolet Monte Carlo. And what followed was one of the most explosive and eventually heartbreaking partnerships the sport has ever produced. Harry Hyde was not Tim Richmond. Hyde was a World War II veteran from Brownsville, Kentucky, who had been building race cars since before Richmond was born. He had won the 1970 NASCAR championship with Bobby Isaac. He was gruff and methodical and old school in every possible way. He had spent decades learning to think about a race in terms of 500 miles, managing your equipment, managing your tires, managing your gearbox, making sure you had what you needed when the race actually mattered, not in the first 50 laps when it didn't. Richmond wanted to sprint from the green flag and figure out the rest later. Hyde said plainly that in April of 1986, he hated every minute of working with Richmond because Tim was so defiant he would not stop long enough to listen to anybody. Here's where it gets really interesting. The friction between them was constant and genuine. Hyde tried to teach Richmond to think about tire wear and brake fade and gear life, and Richmond just wanted to go faster right now. The breakthrough came at North Wilkesboro. Hyde took Richmond to the short track and ran a demonstration. 50 laps Richmond's way, then 50 laps Hyde's way. When they were done, Richmond's tires from the first run were destroyed, shredded. Hyde's tires from the second run were still smooth. The point landed like a sledgehammer. Richmond stopped fighting the old man's approach and they started actually working together. Think of it like a jazz musician who has been playing by ear his entire life, suddenly learning to read sheet music. The talent was always there. Hyde just taught him how to deploy it strategically instead of burning through everything in the first act. After that, the season transformed completely. In 1986, Richmond entered 1986 on a 64-race winless streak. He did not win in the first 12 races of the year. Then he and Hyde figured something out, and in the final 17 races, they went on one of the great runs in 1980s NASCAR. 7 wins, including Pocono twice, Daytona, the Southern 500 at Darlington, and the season finale at Riverside. More wins than any other driver, more poles than any other driver. His 1986 totals read like a Hall of Fame highlight reel. 7 wins, 8 poles, 13 top 5s, and 17 top 10s. The race at Pocono in July of 1986 was maybe the signature Tim Richmond moment. He crashed with Richard Petty early, lost a lap, worked his way back through the entire field, and then, with the leaders bearing down on each other in the closing laps, Richmond got into a 3-wide battle and won it by 0.05 of a second, about the width of a tire. He came on the radio grinning and just said, "That's a NASCAR finish." Darlington was the jewel. The Southern 500 was NASCAR's crown jewel event, the toughest track in the sport, with rough asphalt that ate tires and bit drivers who got lazy. Bill Elliott had been the dominant force in NASCAR that year, in the Coors Ford. But late at Darlington, Elliott's car hit the wall, and Richmond had what he needed. He won it and stood on top of that car afterward like a man who had just proven something to everyone who had ever looked at him sideways. Despite all of it, all 7 wins and all that dominance in the second half of the year, he finished 3rd in the championship, 288 points behind Dale Earnhardt, who had built an insurmountable lead through the winless first half of Richmond's season. 6 points separated him from second place. The what if is easy and painful. If Richmond and Hyde had clicked from race 1 instead of race 13, the 1986 championship was theirs. But here's what most people don't realize. Here is what makes what comes next even harder to absorb. Somewhere in that final stretch of the 1986 season, while Tim Richmond was winning races and standing on cars and looking like the future of the sport, he already knew he was sick. Harry Hyde started noticing something around September of 1986. Richmond looked awful. He was taking antibiotics constantly. After Darlington, he seemed to get better for a stretch, but by the final races, Hyde said he could see it in Tim's face and his eyes. Something was wrong in a way that went past being tired. This was not the fatigue of a long season. This was something else entirely. At NASCAR's annual awards banquet in New York on December 5, 1986, Richmond appeared pale and sweating. Humpy Wheeler, who ran Charlotte Motor Speedway and knew Richmond well, remembered it clearly. He said he could tell it was something worse than stress. Richmond told him he was just exhausted, but Wheeler was genuinely disturbed by how he looked. The next day, Richmond got a call from a physician in California he had seen earlier in the year about a persistent cold. The doctor had test results. He needed Richmond to come back in. Richmond flew to Ohio and checked himself into the Cleveland Clinic under a false name. The diagnosis was pneumocystis pneumonia, a lung infection that almost exclusively appeared in people whose immune systems had been destroyed by HIV. The underlying cause was AIDS. He spent Christmas hospitalized. He lost 23 pounds. He went in at 171 and came out at 148. You have to understand what an AIDS diagnosis meant in December of 1986 to understand why everything that followed happened the way it did. There was no treatment. AZT would not get FDA approval until March of 1987, and even then it barely worked as a solo drug and cost $10,000 a year. Average life expectancy after diagnosis was roughly 12 months. Rock Hudson had died 14 months earlier. Ryan White was fighting just to go to school in Indiana. The public perception of AIDS was that it was a death sentence tied to homosexuality and intravenous drug use, and a certain kind of lifestyle that respectable America wanted nothing to do with. In NASCAR's world, conservative, southern, working-class culture, where the sport had grown up from moonshining country and the fan base skewed heavily toward traditional values, an AIDS diagnosis was about as far outside the understood reality as it was possible to get. Southern boys did not think straight men could get AIDS. That is how Kyle Petty put it years later. That is the world Tim Richmond had to figure out how to navigate while the disease was actively killing him. The official story became double pneumonia. This was technically not wrong. The pneumocystis infection was real, but it hid everything that actually mattered. A tiny circle knew the truth. Dr. Jerry Punch, who was the ESPN pit reporter and had become Richmond's close friend. Rick Hendrick, whose mother Evelyn called directly to explain the situation. Humpy Wheeler suspected it immediately. He said when he found out Richmond was at the Cleveland Clinic, he knew, because that was where you went with AIDS when there was no hope. Everyone else got the pneumonia story. Richmond missed the first 11 races of 1987. Benny Parsons filled in driving the number 25 car. An early test session at Rockingham showed Richmond was too weak to complete a meaningful distance, and he went back to rebuilding his strength. Then on June 14, 1987, Tim Richmond showed up at Pocono Raceway. He took the lead by lap 5, led 82 of the final laps, won by 8 car lengths over Bill Elliott despite losing the ability to use anything but fourth gear after a gearbox problem developed mid-race. When he crossed the finish line, he told the media afterward that he had tears in his eyes when it happened, and that every time anyone congratulated him, he started crying again. In victory lane, he nearly could not speak. He just hugged his mother and whipped a towel in the air like a man who had been given one more afternoon of being exactly who he was. Team manager Jimmy Johnson said later that he had a 5-year-old son, and if his son ever became a race driver and won a race, it would still be second to watching Tim Richmond win at Pocono that day. He said nothing would ever top it. The next weekend at Riverside, Richmond won again, held off Ricky Rudd, and dedicated the Father's Day victory to his dad. That was his 13th and final career victory. He ran 6 more races after Riverside, and then at Michigan in August of 1987, his last race ever, he had to be driven from his motorhome to the car. He qualified 29th. He finished 29th with a blown engine. NASCAR's competition director called Hendrick after that race to say Richmond appeared to be in no shape to be on a racetrack. Richmond resigned from Hendrick Motorsports in September of 1987 to free the team to hire someone for the following season. Benny Parsons got the ride, and Tim Richmond went to Florida and disappeared again. What happened in 1988 is the part of the story that most people don't know, and it is also the part that probably killed him faster than the disease itself would have. In January of 1988, NASCAR announced its very first substance abuse policy. Officials publicly acknowledged that Richmond was one reason the rule had been enacted. He was then the first and only driver tested under the new program. For at least 2 years, no other active driver was subjected to it. Let that sink in. An entire drug testing program, and only one person gets tested. Richmond wanted to come back. His family worried about why. There were real fears that he might be thinking about going out in a blaze of glory on a racetrack rather than wasting away in a hospital room. But he wanted to race, so he found a car with owner Ken Reagan and showed up at Daytona for the Busch Clash All-Star event in February of 1988. Here's where the story turns into something that should make you angry. Knowing he would be drug tested, Richmond made a devastating decision. He stopped taking AZT, his AIDS medication, 6 weeks before the test to prevent any chance of it showing up in results. Think about that for a moment. A man with a terminal disease, a disease that was already destroying his immune system, voluntarily stopped taking the one medication that might slow it down because he was afraid a sanctioning body would use his medical condition against him. He also had his personal physician run a private drug test ahead of time. It came back negative. He had the sample sealed and locked in a safe deposit box in Daytona Beach Shores as insurance. On February 4th, 1988, he gave his official urine sample to NASCAR. 2 days later, NASCAR announced he was suspended indefinitely. PR director Chip Williams told reporters the specimen contained opiates and amphetamines. Now here is what actually happened inside that laboratory, and this comes from testimony and reporting that surfaced in 1990 through a WBBM TV investigation by reporter Roberta Baskin, who had access to sealed court documents and statements from former lab employees. Lab technician Bobby Tovar ran the initial test. It came back negative. At the direction of Dr. Forrest Tennant, NASCAR's testing physician, it was run again. Also negative. A third test found nothing. A fourth, more detailed test found high doses of pseudoephedrine, that is Sudafed and ibuprofen, both over-the-counter cold medications. Nothing else. Despite these results, the lab reported positive results for amphetamines and opiates to NASCAR. About 5 days after the suspension announcement, NASCAR quietly admitted that the substances found were only over-the-counter cold medications. Richmond passed the second official test. At that point, you might expect the story to end with Richmond cleared to race. Instead, NASCAR added a new condition. He could not return to competition until he surrendered his complete medical records from the Cleveland Clinic. Those records contained his AIDS diagnosis. Richmond refused. He hired Barry Slotnick, the New York defense attorney who had famously represented Bernhard Goetz, and filed a lawsuit for $20 million against Bill France Jr., Jim France, Dr. Forrest Tennant, Les Richter, and Chip Williams. NASCAR's legal response was to immediately demand Richmond's tax returns going back 7 years, records of every doctor visit since 1980, results of every test of his blood, urine, or any other bodily fluid since 1980, and his Cleveland Clinic records. They deposed his friends looking for evidence of drug use. Tim's friend, Terry McGovern, said the message from NASCAR's legal team was unmistakable. He said they wanted him to tell them that Tim did drugs. That was what they were looking for. They did not care about the truth. They cared about building a case. A former associate of Dr. Tennant named Gordon Griffith, who had his own grievances with Tennant, and you should flag that accordingly, alleged that NASCAR's competition director Les Richter had told him Bill France Jr. wanted to construct a drug program specifically to disqualify Richmond. Griffith quoted Richter as saying France was concerned about one particular driver who was outspoken and bizarre, and Richter believed must be a drug user. And Griffith quoted Tennant's alleged response as something along the lines of, "If you want something done about it, you have come to the best, because we can take care of him." Lab technician Bobby Tovar independently corroborated key details of this account, without any apparent coordination with Griffith, which is why it cannot just be dismissed as the words of a disgruntled former employee. But Griffith was a fired employee and was separately charged with making threatening phone calls to Tennant, so take the specifics with appropriate caution. What is not in dispute is what Bill France Jr. said on camera in 2006 in an interview that aired in the ESPN 30 for 30 documentary about Richmond. He said, "The test we did was not a good test, and the test got messed up, and we took him out." That is the president of NASCAR admitting it on film. Those exact words, "We took him out." Unable to race, Richmond hired a small airplane and had it fly over Daytona International Speedway on race day, trailing a banner that read, "Fans, I miss you, Tim Richmond." The lawsuit settled out of court in January of 1989. Terms were sealed. By that point, Richmond was far too ill to race anyway. Here is what most people don't realize about the timeline, and this is the part that should haunt everyone involved. Richmond went off his AIDS medication for 6 weeks to pass a drug test that the lab ran negative at least twice before reporting it positive. 6 weeks without AZT, while his immune system was already compromised by a disease that was killing him. Multiple sources have made the point directly. If NASCAR had not forced him into that situation, he might have lived longer. The disease might still have taken him, almost certainly would have, but probably not as fast. Those 6 weeks were not a neutral period. They were 6 weeks of an already weakened immune system losing ground it could never recover. Through 1988 and into 1989, Richmond retreated to the Florida condominium he shared with his mother in near total isolation. Almost nobody from NASCAR came. Rick Hendrick stayed close. Dr. Jerry Punch visited. AJ Foyt was one of the rare racing people who showed up. The vast majority of drivers stayed away. Kyle Petty was honest about it in a way most others were not. He said it all came down to AIDS, and nobody in the sport knew how to handle it, especially in a sport as backward thinking on so many things as NASCAR was at that time. Think about that. A man who had been their colleague, their competitor, a man some of them had raced alongside for years, and they could not bring themselves to visit him because the disease that was killing him frightened them more than their sense of decency compelled them. In 1989, his sister Sandra Welch described what Tim's days were like. He would go into his bedroom, close the blinds, and sit in the darkness day after day. He was angry, not just sad, angry at God, at what had happened to him, at everything. His mother told people she could not find words for how devastated he was, not just by dying, but by the specific disease that was killing him. The stigma was not separate from the illness. They were the same wound. In July of 1989, ESPN broadcast a NASCAR race at Pocono, and someone at the network sent a get-well card to the hospital and put together a video package of Richmond's 1986 Pocono victory to show him. Dr. Punch was there. He said when the footage came on, Richmond and Victory Lane with the team around him and the beauty queens and the crowd, the hospital staff who had been seeing the skeletal figure in a hospital bed every single day started crying because they were seeing who he actually was. And the distance between that image and what was in front of them was devastating in a way that words cannot properly capture. On August 13th, 1989, Tim Richmond called his mother at 4 in the morning. She came. At 5:12 a.m., Tim Richmond died in a coma at Good Samaritan Hospital in West Palm Beach, Florida. The death certificate listed cardiopulmonary arrest, gastrointestinal hemorrhaging, and AIDS. He was buried at Ashland County Memorial Park in Ohio after a private ceremony for family only. He had specifically asked that no members of the racing community attend. The local newspaper could not find which funeral home had handled it because all three in Ashland denied any involvement. 10 days after his death, the family held a press conference. His physician, Dr. David Dodson, read the statement. It said Tim died of complications of AIDS, which he contracted through heterosexual contact. The family said they wanted to go public, hoping others might be spared what had happened to Tim. When word reached the NASCAR paddock, the immediate reaction from several prominent drivers was not sorrow, but blame. Dale Earnhardt told reporters he believed Richmond had gotten AIDS through drug use. Jeff Bodine said obviously it was the result of drugs. Richard Petty appeared in later interviews with what one reporter described as visible disgust and raised questions about drug use while driving. That is the garage rationalizing what they did not want to be true. Because if Tim Richmond had gotten AIDS through heterosexual contact, then none of them were safe. It was easier to make him the problem, to frame his death as a consequence of his own recklessness, than to sit with the terrifying randomness of a disease that did not care about your lifestyle or your values or whether you were a good old boy from North Carolina or a rich kid from Ohio. Dr. Punch ended up sending more than 90 people from the NASCAR traveling show for HIV testing that summer. 90 people. That number tells you everything about how scared they actually were once they stopped pretending they were not. In the years that followed, NASCAR essentially acted like Tim Richmond had never raced. Here is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Davey Allison and Alan Kawicki both died in 1993, and they became instant heroes. Tributes, memorials, souvenir merchandise still selling decades later. Rightfully so, their deaths were tragedies. But Richmond got one line in the official history and no photographs. A souvenir vendor at Pocono told a journalist in 1994 that it was the first time he had ever heard the name Tim Richmond, at a track where the man had won 4 times. The rehabilitation happened slowly. He was named one of NASCAR's 50 greatest drivers in 1998, the first major official acknowledgement that he existed. He went into the International Motorsports Hall of Fame in 2002. And then in 2010, ESPN released its 30 for 30 documentary about him, called Tim Richmond to the Limit, directed by Rory Karpf. And it brought the full story to a new generation. The drug test, the AIDS cover-up, the lawsuit, France's on-camera admission, and the voices of people like Kyle Petty and Darrell Waltrip and Humpy Wheeler, who had been there for all of it. His sister Sandra Welch agreed to participate after a long time of not speaking publicly. She said she had worried about him being dragged through the dirt again. The fact that she had to worry about that tells you how thoroughly the sport had failed him. Larry McReynolds, who worked with Davey Allison and Dale Jarrett and Ernie Irvan and Dale Earnhardt over a career that spanned the golden age of the sport, said something in interviews around that time that is worth sitting with. He said in his entire career in NASCAR, Tim Richmond was the most talented race car driver in terms of raw talent he had ever seen. Not the most successful, the most talented. That is a distinction that matters. Success in racing is a product of talent plus equipment plus health plus institutional support plus time. Richmond had the talent. He had the equipment for exactly one full season. He never had the health, the institutional support, or the time. Kyle Petty said drivers who dominated the sport in the 1990s would not have done so if Tim had lived. He believed it completely. Rick Hendrick still wonders about the championships that might have been. As of right now, Tim Richmond has never appeared on a NASCAR Hall of Fame ballot. He is the only driver on both the 50 greatest and 75 greatest driver lists who has not been inducted or even nominated. There is an ongoing campaign by fans to get him on the ballot. It has around 5,000 supporters. Meanwhile, a road inside the Hendrick Motorsports complex is named Hyde's Way, after his crew chief, Harry Hyde. Hendrick drivers have run Tim Richmond throwback paint schemes at Darlington. His face shows up on merchandise. He exists in the memory of the people who watched him, but not in the official structure of the institution he lit on fire. And that gap between memory and recognition is where the real story lives. Team manager Jimmy Johnson has kept a private ritual since 1989. Every January, he turns his new desk calendar to August 13th and writes 4 words. Tim died 5:12 a.m. every year for more than 3 decades. That is not institutional memory. That is personal grief doing the work that the institution refused to do. Here is the thing about Tim Richmond's legacy, and this is what I keep coming back to every time I think about this story. It is not the 13 wins and 185 starts, though if you do the math on that win rate for the era, it is remarkable. It is not the 1986 season that, by any honest measure, should have produced a championship. It is not the 2 wins at Pocono in June of 1987 while he was secretly dying, though those 2 races belong on a very short list of the most extraordinary performances in motorsport history. A man who had lost 23 pounds and whose immune system was being systematically destroyed, leading 82 laps on 4th gear only and crossing the finish line crying. The real legacy is what his story reveals about who gets to be remembered and on what terms, and what happens when a sport or a culture decides that someone's death is too inconvenient to acknowledge honestly. In 1989, an AIDS diagnosis still meant something died with you beyond just your body. It meant your reputation, your legacy, your place in the record books could be quietly rearranged by the people who controlled the narrative. And NASCAR, which had either deliberately constructed a drug testing program to push Richmond out, or had run such an incompetent one that the practical effect was exactly the same, had every institutional reason to let him stay buried. Because acknowledging Tim Richmond meant acknowledging what they had done to Tim Richmond. And that was a conversation nobody at the top wanted to have. The rock star who died in silence has been getting louder lately. Maybe not loud enough yet, but louder. 13 wins, 14 poles, 7 wins in 1986 alone. A championship that was right there, and a June afternoon at Pocono in 1987 when a dying man in a car he could barely climb into led 82 laps on 4th gear only and crossed the finish line with tears streaming down his face. That is the story of Tim Richmond. That is all of it. And if the sport he gave everything to still cannot bring itself to put him in its Hall of Fame, then maybe the Hall of Fame is the thing that needs to answer for what it is missing, not the man who is absent from it.